On. Good morning to everyone. It's a big pleasure to be here with you. We are a large group of people, and the Eurodefense-Portugal and the Autónoma University of Lisbon and the Research Center OBSERVARE. We are very happy to organize in close partnership a cycle of conferences aiming to discuss the current geopolitical scenario with a clear focus on Europe. These conferences are a group of four. They will be designed as EUROTALKs and will be conducted in English, as for sure. And the idea is to have a broad audience, which really we are just seeing today with a large group of people attending. This first conference will address the relations between Europe and China. Others will follow. Next one will be Europe-Russia, and it will take place in principle on the 2nd of June. And after, in the first semester, after that, maybe by October, we will have another one on the relationship Europe-United States. And the last one will be we'll concentrate on specific European strengths and difficulties. So we will begin immediately with Professor Major General Tiago Vasconcelos, that will raise the issue. Other professors will follow, Carlos Gaspar and Luís Tomé. But Tiago Vasconcelos, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Good morning, everyone, and thanks to the organization for inviting me. Six years ago, the year before the pandemic, the EU declared that China could no longer be regarded as a developing country, and as much as a strategic partner, it was simultaneously considered an economic competitor and a systemic rival. 4 years later, with the war in Ukraine already ongoing, the EU declared that it did not intend to decouple its economy from China's, but just de-risking and diversifying. Finally, the white paper on defense, released only a couple of weeks ago, states that the challenge posed by China is both systematic, as China has a non-democratic system of government, and systemic, as China's approach to trade, investment, and technology seeks to achieve primacy and, in some cases, supremacy. China, for its part, in its official statements, has been claiming for Europe to jointly protect multilateralism and opposed to unilateral hegemony, declaring that the two sides are partners, not rivals, and that China sees Europe as an important pole in the multipolar world. Naturally, as President Trump's style approach to Europe weakens transatlantic cohesion, it is undeniable that China sees fresh opportunities to repair its relationships in Europe. That the EU and China are extremely important trading partners, there's no question about that. In goods immediately followed by the US, China is the EU's biggest supplier, Chinese goods representing around 20% of all the goods imported by the EU. And after the US and the UK, China is the third biggest client of the EU. Around 9% of the goods that the EU exports go to China. Regarding trade in services and direct investment, however, the picture is a lot different, and overall, the US still is by far the EU's main trading and investment partner. It's impossible to give a definite answer to the question about how the new US administration's behavior will impact on EU-China relations. For example, is it conceivable that the EU would be willing to dramatically improve its relationship with China at the expense of its relationship with the US? Will the current political developments in the US, its ripple effects across the world, or the deep global trends that affect international events worldwide favor the emergence of a more multipolar world and an independent EU as one of its poles in a relatively short term? Well, it is undeniable that in many circles there is a growing feeling that the EU and its member states, as well as some other NATO allies and European countries that do not belong to the EU, will need to do things previously thought absolutely impossible to do, and to do it so at speeds not seen in many years. For instance, following last February German elections, the future Chancellor said Europe must achieve independence from the United States, and suggested that France and Britain could share nuclear weapons with Berlin. Polish Prime Minister has said he wanted to discuss his country's nuclear options as well. Meanwhile, Poland plans to spend 4.7% of its GDP on defense this year, Sweden 3.5%, and Germany, now released from the debt brake, will likely follow suit. All that said, even if the European Union has the resources and the ideas to grow stronger economically and strategically, it would be completely unrealistic to ignore that many domestic challenges hinder the way for an independent EU. Because of that, I think that in the near term, neither the EU will dramatically improve its relationship with China, much less at the expense of its relationship with the US, nor become a truly independent political actor. So I'll try to argue in 3 points that the EU political approach to China will, for still some years to come, likely remain fundamentally aligned with the US-China strategy. The first point I want to make is that the European Union is much more than a market, to borrow from the title of Letta's report, but it is much less than a sovereign power. This is not to belittle the EU common foreign and security and defense policies, their civilian and military structures, processes and missions, the role of the European Defence Agency in defence planning and capability development, the designation of a commissioner for space and defence in the new commission, the efforts to fostering common procurement and defence industry European champions, and many other recent developments, like for instance, the competitiveness compass for the EU, which in a great deal resulted from Mario Draghi's report. All those developments are truly formidable and suggest that sooner rather than later, the EU may become a much more geopolitical actor. The White Paper for Defence Readiness 2030, including the Rearm Europe plan, is of itself a remarkable development as well, even if we're still about to see how member states will respond to the Safe Loan scheme and how many of them will activate and to what extent the national escape clause of the Stability and Growth Pact, as they were invited to by the Commission. However, the EU is not a sovereign power. It may be one day, but it's not yet. And for the time being, the pooling forces that result from or explore the diversity of national strategic cultures and related threat perceptions in the EU still seem to be stronger than the forces that could push it into the much deeper political and economic integration that true strategic autonomy would require. And for that matter, the expected enlargement will make that diversity only bigger. The second point I want to make is that the US strategic priorities are clearly changing, but the full American retreat from Europe shouldn't be a foregone conclusion. No matter all rhetoric and posturing, American economy and indeed American security will still likely call for the maintenance of dozens of American military bases across the globe and the forward deployment of American forces and other assets in Europe and Northeast Asia. It's hard to believe that the American military facilities in Spain, Italy, the UK, Germany, Romania, Poland, and other places in Europe, among other things, allowing the US to more easily project hard military power to the Middle East and other places, suddenly would no longer be important for the US national security. It's true that the US may definitely influence events across the globe from its offshore position, but neither a North American fortress nor the pivot to Asia do suggest or imply a full retreat from Europe and other parts of the planet. Besides that, it is important to bear in mind that the EU and the US have the largest bilateral trade and investment relationship and the most integrated economic relationship in the world. Thus, American economic interests in Europe are far from trivial. The US-EU trade volume is three times as big as the US-China trade volume, and twice the EU-China one. As far as investment is concerned, figures are even more overwhelming. American investment in the EU27 is 55% of total US overseas direct investment. And 60% of the EU foreign direct investment is in the US, 60%. The investment partnership between the US and the EU represents approximately 30% of global foreign direct investment stocks. The third point I want to make is that for each of the EU member states, it is extremely important, if not vital, to preserve a good bilateral relationship with the US. Even if European innocence may have been lost forever these days, as far as its relationship with the US is concerned, many people in Europe will think, probably rightly so, that it is too soon to give up on America. The Italian Prime Minister, for instance, only a few days ago declared the US to be Italy's first ally. Not only because of the perceived Russian conventional and especially nuclear threat and the war in Ukraine, but also because an American strategic retreat from Europe may not favor the emergence of an independent EU. For some, such retreat may at best favor a very loose defense confederation, and for many others, it may at worst unleash a spiral of further political fragmentation. Many European countries still prefer to keep Americans in, provided, of course, Americans do not irrevocably decide to strategically retreat from Europe, which is always a possibility, of course, and one that Europeans are obviously unable to control. To conclude my presentation, for the US, China is the only competitor with both the intent to challenge the American primacy in the global system and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to advance that objective. Preventing China of outcompeting the US is the priority of US national security strategy and the only thing that unites both Democrats and Republicans. Both camps defend significant trade and technology restrictions aimed at China, even if occasionally they may disagree over whether tariffs are better or worse than subsidies. Consequently, despite its leaders' only apparently abrupt geopolitical awakening, the European Union to use relations with China, and we would note that China would wanted to do that as well, to use relations with China in a way that the US might consider harmful to its fundamental interests would equate to a challenge the EU and its member states cannot afford, even if they were willing to do so, which doesn't seem to be the case anyway. Therefore, unless the US either completely recalibrates its relationship with China or persists in an aggressive behavior against the EU and its member states' interests and values, the EU approach to China, especially at the time when China is aligning with Russia, is unlikely to radically depart from its current assumptions. And that's why I think that, as I said earlier, the EU political and strategic approach to China will, for years to come, likely remain fundamentally aligned with the US-China strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for in a so important subject. We will go on. I would also say that please take note of your notes, and after the three speeches, of course, you will be free to raise your questions either in the audience or in the Zoom, of course. Professor Carlos Gaspar, the floor is now.
The microphone too. Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. We are on the eve of a European Union-China summit that will celebrate 50 years of relations between Brussels and Beijing. 50 years ago, the 9 member states of the European communities were united in recognizing China as an ally in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. But today, the 27 members of the European Union are deeply divided on the issue of relations with China. The Chinese authorities recognize this fact, and the Chinese media stress the high level of diplomatic relations with Southern European countries, in contrast with relations with Northern European countries. Last month, the French and Portuguese foreign ministers were in Beijing, where the Spanish Prime Minister is expected in a few weeks' time. The Hungarian Prime Minister is, of course, the most esteemed partner of the People's Republic of China in the EU. A number of Central and Eastern European countries have signed memoranda of understanding with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And since Italy left the Belt and Road Initiative in 2023, Portugal is the only Western country that still has a memorandum of understanding with the Belt and Road Initiative. Outside of the European Union, the British Foreign Minister also went to Beijing last month, but there is no sign of the Germans in China, although Germany is by far the most important partner of China in Europe. Also, the European Commission and its president remain committed to the strategy of de-risking established since 2023, and also to the European Economic Security Strategy. Both were designed first and foremost to counter Chinese political and economic penetration of EU countries, which has been recognized as a threat to EU strategic autonomy, at least since 2015. The European Union's China strategy officially describes China, as the General said, as a strategic partner, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. In 2022, NATO, for the first time, recognized China as a challenge to its security and as a decisive enabler of Russia's efforts in the war against Ukraine. There is a prevailing consensus on the European Union and in European political opinion representing China as a threat. Germany's new coalition draft program describes China only as a systemic rival, no longer as a partner or a competitor. And the new white paper on defense of the European Union goes in the same direction. And the next Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, is on record considering China as part of the, and I quote, axis of autocratic powers challenging the international order. The internal divisions of the European Union vis-à-vis China remain strong. And in this context, it is difficult to speak of the European Union as a unified entity in relations with its second or third largest trade partner. The latest transatlantic crisis has already been addressed by General Vasconcelos following the election of the US president in 2024, has reopened the old debate, the old European debate on whether China can be an alternative to the US, on whether the European Union can ally with China to counterbalance the United States, and on whether the European Union can balance between China and the US to take advantage of the clash, of the coming clash between the two superpowers. The answer to the three questions remains the same. China is not an alternative to the United States, even if the American superpower is in decline. The European Union will not ally with China to counterbalance the United States, even if the American president attacks the US, the European Union, as worse than our enemies. And the European Union will not balance between the US and China, both of which can and would divide the European Union if it ever tried to balance between the two superpowers. The European Union was and remains incapable of defining a joint, a common strategy vis-à-vis the United States. Obviously, no one in the European Union wants to be bogged down in the two-front trade war with the two superpowers. But the transatlantic crisis has not made the problems of Europe's relations with China any smaller. And it would be disastrous if Europe, in order to reduce its dependence from the United States, ended up increasing its dependence on China. My last point refers to the present situation. I'm sorry, I had a wrong number here. In the present situation, the European Union will be ready to reduce tensions with China, but it will not significantly change its position vis-à-vis China. Firstly, China is and will remain aligned with Russia. Russia is China's principal strategic partner in the struggle with the United States, and since the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war, Russia is clearly recognized as the main strategic threat to NATO and the European Union. Secondly, the European Union is and will remain committed to integrating the Ukraine and to ensure the survival of an independent sovereign state in Ukraine in its struggle against Russia, which is supported by China. This is a crucial issue, indeed an existential issue for the European Union. And this issue stands in the way of European political rapprochement with China. Thirdly, the United States is concentrating on the containment of China. As the General said, it is the only matter on which Republicans and Democrats agree. They disagree on everything else. And the European Union is not ready to move against the key priority of American international strategy. This would further complicate NATO's management of the transatlantic crisis, and almost all of the European Union member states are also members of NATO, and most of the EU members and the NATO members recognize that there is no real alternative to the US alliance, even if the American president downgrades the US military presence in Europe and undermines the credibility of the US strategic reassurance to Germany and Europe. This does not mean that either the European Union or the main European powers will follow the US strategy of containing China. The EU strategy of de-risking is not the same as the American strategy of decoupling. even if the Chinese President Xi Jinping, as he said to the European Commission President in 2023, even if Xi Jinping sees no difference between the two. In fact, the European Union may have to use some of the instruments that were designed to counter China in the build-up of the European economic security strategy, also in its relations with the United States. At the same time, the European Union must enhance its own Europe First economic strategy, both vis-à-vis the United States and China. I don't know if I have time for that.
Yes.
Thank you. Now I
5
come.
more minutes.
5 more. Now I come to my last point, and this is something that was suggested by General Vasconcelos' presentation, and it is a different issue. Could this situation change if China changes strategy towards the European Union? Presently, China dismisses the EU as divided, vulnerable, and weak. Also, the Chinese authorities stress that China can achieve full self-sufficiency and that it does not need Europe. Could China change its own strategy vis-à-vis the European Union? Could Xi Jinping do a reverse Deng? We are now always talking about the reverse Kissinger, but we can imagine also a reverse Deng. A reverse Deng, according to François Godemont, Europe's most relevant sinologist, implies a paradigm shift in China's policy and, I quote François Godemont, a reversal of perspective. Chinese firms would become joint venture partners in Europe, which involves, as was the case in China during the past 30 years, that their European partners absorb a good deal of the technology and processes in which these Chinese firms have become more advanced than European countries. End of quote. This could be achieved without either spending EU procurement funds and subsidies, or more importantly, without creating new risks to European economic security and to EU member states' national security. There are, however, a few obstacles to this hypothetical change in China's strategy. First of all, Xi Jinping is not Deng Xiaoping, and he does not have a comparable authority vis-à-vis over the Chinese Communist Party. Second, the dominant direction of China's strategy is towards confrontation with the United States in a framework of bipolarization between the US-led collective West and China's-led global East. And suddenly, both the US and China are pursuing parallel strategies of decoupling that will challenge the multilateral global order and reinforce protectionist trends. Still, and I conclude here, still with the return of high-intensity interstate wars in Europe, change seems to be the new normal in international relations, and change may transform relations between the powers in unexpected and surprising ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we will have a very interesting EU-China summit, which is scheduled, as the professor just said, by the end of the year, without a specific date, and without Xi. He was invited, but usually not yet decided. There was a first reaction that would be the Minister of Foreign Affairs as usual. Well, we will wait and see. So an interesting summit will take place, and we will all of us, pay attention to this. Apart from the problems that were already raised here, like the Ukraine subject, and of course differences of opinion concerning human rights and also the kind of state of limbo of the agreement on investment. So there are plenty of interesting subjects that will be raised for sure by the end of the year between the European Union and China. And now I will, the floor is with Professor Lisbon. Thank you.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. The relationship between the European Union and China has evolved, as it was already said, into a complex mixture of cooperation, competition, and systemic rivalry. And in recent years, this relationship has faced significant challenges. But if the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been a shock for Europe, the second Trump administration is even more shocking. Russia's war against Ukraine ended a long period of peace in Europe. And the second term of Trump's America First policy ended the European security order on which peace depended. So we need to switch our mind. That means that relationship with China might be more important now than it was before. On the other hand, European countries and the EU are not in a position geographically, economically, or strategically to compete or move away from Russia, the US, and China at the same time. And in a new inverted world, Europe risks becoming the primary target and the main victim. At the same time, there is an opportunity for the EU to assert itself as a geopolitical player and to recalibrate its relationship not only with China and the US, but also from Canada, Mexico, Brazil, all Latin America, Africa, and of course, Asia-Pacific partners. But my idea is to show some data and address some challenges and opportunities in this new environment. What happened? Back to open again my PowerPoint. Yeah. Trade is, of course, one of the main pillars of this relationship. And despite some frictions, China-EU trade rises by 1.56% in 2024. The EU remains China's second largest trading partner after the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and China is the second US trade partner after the United States. I remember that after the Trump first edition, China became the first trade partner of the European Union. In 2024, the EU exported goods worth more than 200 billion to China and imported more than 500 billion from China. So, resulting in a trade deficit of more than 300 billion. This is one of the most irritant things in our relationship. On trade, as we can see, the cumulative value of Chinese foreign direct investment in the EU since the year 2000 stood at 184 billion in the last year. But pay attention that the Chinese FDI in the EU averaged 514 million annually in between the years 2000 and 2009 and 11.9 billion annually in 2010, 2024. The cumulative value of the EU FDI in China since the year 2000 stood at more or less 185 billion in 2024. EU FDI in China averaged from 5 billion annually in the years 2009 to 9 billion annually in the years 2010, 2024. The EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment proved short-lived. After 7 years of negotiations, only 5 months passed between its political agreement in December 2020 and European Parliament voting to freeze its ratification in May 2021. Why? Because in March 2021, Beijing sanctioned 10 individuals and 4 entities within the European Union in retaliation for EU sanctions that same month targeting Chinese individuals and entities involved in the persecution and mass detention of Uyghurs in the Xinjiang province. Probably another major irritant in our relationship with China is the EU's dependence on China for key raw materials. As we can see, when the European Commission tried to understand what kind of dependencies we have, more than a half of critical raw materials are coming from China. And in some materials, that rises almost 100%, including rare earths. But not only critical materials, solar panels, wind turbines, solar inverter manufacturers, and so on. So the question is, the healthy interdependence is now a critical dependence of the EU concerning China. And it is in this kind of moment and context that came the new US tariffs. As we can see, more and more tariffs, including last one, reciprocal tariffs, both against China and European Union. China is now targeted with 54% new tariffs, the 20% before and now plus 34%. The European Union, 20% more, and of course, plus automobiles and so on. But pay attention, on March 31, for the first time in 5 years, China, Japan, and South Korea made their first economic dialogue. And the sentence they sent to the world and the US administration is that the 3 countries, China, Japan, and South Korea, agreed to jointly respond to US tariffs. As we all know, Japan and South Korea are allies of the United States. And of course, China is trying to invite also the European Union to jointly resist US tariffs. So what kind of challenges and opportunities do we have on trade and investment? The question is the risking or re-engagement. Of course, there are a lot of problems and challenges coming from investment screening. Only in the year 2023, EU screened 423 Chinese foreign direct investment deals in the EU, up 45% since 2020. The EU's de-risking strategy, of course, because of the critical materials, semiconductors, and so on, and China's economic coercion, including Lithuania trade blockade. Chinese EV tariffs versus retaliation risks, and of course, the China Belt and Road Initiative, in particular in countries such as Portugal, Hungary, and Serbia, versus the EU's Global Gateway Initiative. There is a key difference. The EU regulates China defensively. China exploits EU divisions to bypass restrictions. There are now probably some more opportunities on joint efforts to retaliate and mitigate US tariffs, deepening economic ties, and upholding WTO rules, third market cooperation, including in Latin America and Asia Pacific, or even Africa, selective economic cooperation, and maybe recurring the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. But there are key questions that we still do not have the answer. Can the EU and China agree on reciprocal market access? Can the trade balance become more balanced? Can re-engagement be reconciled with the risking and use autonomy over critical Chinese materials? Another topic is technology and security, and the question is how limited is the cooperation? Of course, some challenges involve the EU's concerns on Chinese espionage, and of course, again, de-risking from China in critical technology. China, of course, denies allegations while advancing in tech and cyber capabilities and accelerates self-resilience, and persists mutual distrust. EU sanctioning Chinese hackers, and China is banning EU firms, just like McKinsey raids. And of course, there is US pressure for the EU to exclude Chinese technology, including in the NATO cyber defense frameworks. The key difference, the EU regulates China defensively again and frames cybersecurity as a values-based issue. China exploits EU divisions and treats cybersecurity as sovereignty. There are limited opportunities to cooperate in artificial intelligence governance and climate technologies, and also a limited cooperation model, just like the joint IA-driven terror finance trafficking. Of course, avoiding infrastructure ties. The key question is, will the EU develop its own tech cyber sovereignty? Maybe it's easier to cooperate on the environment and climate, but mixing with energy, there is also room for rivalry. The EU's dependence on China for key raw materials is a huge challenge, but there are opportunities on joint research and development in battery, recycling, and hydrogen, and of course, joint support on Paris Agreement and align on UN climate change conferences commitments. On various topics of international security, there are challenges, more challenges than opportunities, from counter-piracy and maritime security, Arctic security. There is probably very small room for cooperation, but there are on non-proliferation and arms control, including on the Iran issue, peacekeeping. If we are able to avoid the Chinese peacekeepers in Europe, for instance, in Russia, as some are saying, and including in space and satellite security, mainly in the compatibility between the EU's Galileo project and the Chinese Beijing. Anyway, the big question is on geopolitics. The triangle US, EU, and China. I would like to underline these key differences on the general outlook. The EU security framework is NATO's based, while China views NATO as a Cold War relic, operates through a non-aligned narrative, leveraging bilateral and multilateral partnerships from BRICS group to Shanghai Cooperation Organization and so on. Shortly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in April 2022, China put forward its Global Security Initiative. But this initiative emphasized legitimate security concerns. And of course, we can easily interpret this Chinese initiative as promoting and justifying the Russian and the Chinese, at least, territorial claims. On Ukraine war, EU is committed to supporting Ukraine militarily and financially, and of course, sanctioning Russia. While China is officially neutral, but its non-limits partnership with Russia limits its credibility. In terms of the world order, the EU is a status quo player trying to preserve the liberal rules-based order, while China prioritizes multipolarity and wants its narrative and wants to replace the US-led order with its vision proposed of global community of shared future. And I have here two sentences. See how China is proposing a dichotomy between two options, the Cold War mentality and its own vision of common well-being. And in the official document in English version, the tug of war between these two options will shape the future of humanity. And of course, according to the President Xi Jinping, every increase of China's strength is an increase of the prospects of world peace. Probably most Europeans do not agree with this. Anyway, Trump's second edition is disruptive, and it is assumed that it is against the liberal rules-based order. It is a weapon used against the United States. So it is not Russia or China. It is the US who is now trying to destroy the liberal world order. On the other hand, not even Xi Jinping or Putin says what Donald Trump said in its inaugural address, that the US wants to expand its territory. Greenland, Canada, Panama Canal, and so on. And when the Europeans are waiting for the peace proposal to Ukraine, the US Vice President, the famous J.D. Vance, came and said that the most threatening in Europe is not coming from Russia or China. He's worried with the threat from within. So the behavior of this administration is like a treason. It is maybe transforming NATO, meaning a no alternative to obsolescence, or trying to transform NATO into a Warsaw Pact with its doctrine of limited sovereignty, as we all remember Brezhnev doctrine and invaded Czechoslovakia. Just look what happened with Greenland. And this is an inverted world. 3 years after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in UN General Assembly, in a resolution concerning Ukraine, the United States voted with Russia or Belarus or North Korea. So this is unthinkable just a few months ago. While China kept its neutrality narrative and abstained, or Iran even, but not the US. And we all remember the bullying against President Zelensky at the White House. So this is a huge shift in US foreign policy. Something happened again. Let me try to open. No. Yeah. And 3 days after what happened in the White House with Zelensky, and a week after the voting at the UN General Assembly, the Japanese Prime Minister said, today's Ukraine could be tomorrow's East Asia. And of course, in what he was thinking is on the Chinese territorial ambitions. Of course, South China Sea, East China Sea, and Taiwan. Taiwan is probably the big issue that we will show what is going on in the relations between the US and China. but we have several signs that maybe this administration is also shifting the strategic ambiguity of the US in the last few decades. Trump is supposed to be said this in 2019. Taiwan is like 2 feet from China. We are 8,000 miles away. If they invade, there isn't a fucking thing we can do about it. This US Secretary of State called to Chinese Foreign Affairs Minister saying that the US does not support Taiwan independence. And the Secretary of Defense Colby said that he believed the costs of explicitly committing to Taiwan's defense outweighed its benefits. And as we have seen, including this week, there are coming more and more Chinese military exercises against Taiwan. That's why also the Taiwanese intelligence is concerned for possible US shift on China. So in my view, what is happening is that this quick push from Trump to a deal in Ukraine, favoring Russia, is undermining, of course, transatlantic cohesion. We, Europeans, are reliant on US umbrella, but we are fearing to be abandoned by the US. And of course, there was already huge decisions on Europe's defense without the US. And of course, China is trying to exploit US-EU friction to expand influence. In the same conference in Munich, where the US Vice President said that the threat is coming from within, the Chinese Foreign Affairs Minister appealed for EU-China strategic communication. The question is that Europe's strategic autonomy must now also consider another scenario. It is a US, Russia, China condominium or great powers concert, recreating zones of influence of these three revisionist powers with territorial ambitions. That's why probably we are now in the most dangerous moment, because taking advantage of these several things, maybe China and Russia advance simultaneously on their territorial ambitions. We are in a military position, we have no ammunitions, missiles, and so on, nor us, European US allies, nor Asia-Pacific US allies. And so, not in 2027, but soon, something could happen, including because of these wrong signs that are coming from Washington. To conclude, there is a fragile balance in the EU-China's relations under Trump 2.0. There are certain convergence areas, certain divergence flashpoints. There is the wild card. Trump's unpredictability may push the EU toward pragmatic deals with China. Maybe the best case is the managed competition with selective cooperation or selective engagement model. That means EU-China carve out functional niches, for instance, climate security, peacekeeping, IA governance, WMD, arms control, WTO reform, civilian space safety, while avoiding high-risk areas such as South China Sea, Taiwan, and NATO-Russia. EU-China relations are currently characterized by an intricate balance between engagement and caution. While economic cooperation remains indispensable, the future trajectory of this relationship largely depends on the development of each one's relationship with the US, as well as the dynamics of war and peace in Ukraine, the Arctic, the China Seas, and the Taiwan Strait. At the same time, the future trajectory of EU-China relations will likely hinge on China's internal and external policies and use capacity to maintain unity and strategic coherence. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll have in front of us multiple group of issues and ideas, and fortunately, we have more or less 1 hour until the end of this session, and I will be glad to receive your questions, observations, suggestions, whatever, from the audience and also from the Zoom. So please go ahead.
Não, o som está aberto para os se quiserem escolher.
Okay, you can people in the Zoom audience can raise your hands, and afterwards you can formulate your questions or suggestions. But I presume that we have one person in the audience. Yeah,
Aqui.
General,
O que é que sentaste?
please.
Tens de estar de pé.
General Valença Pinto,
All right.
please go ahead.
Morning. Thank you very much for your presentations. You have provided us a very interesting and fruitful session with lots of issues to think about. Your option, the option of the three panelists was really to put the question in a very broad perspective. I think this is entirely appropriate and right. And you will excuse me to limit a little bit my question or the scope of it, because what I would like to ask you is your comment on something that I believe it is, and it will be perhaps even bigger in the future, land of attrition between the European Union and China. And I'm referring to the growing Chinese influence in Africa, and for us, most importantly, in Northern Africa and in the Sahel region, trying to replace the traditional European influence in the area, be it acting China by itself or also in cooperation with Russia with the same purpose. So that's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe we will collect a group of questions, maybe 2 or 3, and then we'll have the answers. Please. Microphone. Okay.
Okay.
Maybe it's, yeah,
Okay,
it's
okay.
your turn. Thank you.
It's just a quick question. This is not something that usually it's discussed. We discussed more here in the West, the division in the United States right now, the bipolar society that the US is turning. So my question is more about China, because China through history, it's a society that through the years it breaks. Sometimes it has a lot of division inside. It's normal. It's a continental country. It's a civilization that has more than 2,000 years and different peoples. And sometimes it breaks into several other societies or countries. And my question is, in the future, is it possible that these seizures will appear more evident? And what does it mean for these new geopolitical changes over the next decades? And what will happen, basically, in your opinion, if this happens again? Thank you.
Thank you. Please. Could you announce your name and for us to
Hi,
know?
my name is Sonia Candeias. Thank you for your words. And I'm thinking if it is possible to discuss United Europe relations with China without thinking the relations between Russian and China, because in this moment, many companies, Chinese companies, are in Russia, and Russia is investing a lot in China. And if United Europe wanted to increase the relations with China, it's not possible to promote the Russians companies, because in technology, IA, many companies from Russians are investing in China and in Africa, and they can come to Europe if Europe doesn't create some restrictions. That's what I'm thinking when I think to increase the relations with China.
Okay. Thank you very much. So maybe, sorry. Yeah. Let's just a moment. We already have three questions, three different ideas. Maybe the first one concerns China in Africa. Maybe General to answer in the same order.
Shall we start with?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, the global competition for influence between China, the US, and other countries, Russia, is global. Currently, is global. Africa is only one of the theaters where we can see that competition. It's not new. It's not new because we remember during colonial war we had liberation movements that were supported by the US, others were supported by Russia, others were supported by China. So that competition there always existed. Now it takes new forms because China now is not a poor country anymore, has many resources that can allocate to this competition for influence. Belt and Road Initiative comes to mind immediately. Tanzania, Zambia railways come to mind as well. Ports to favor trade. But I don't think the West is distracted, very distracted, because we see, which is incredible. It was something that I could not expect, but the only visit that President Biden made to Africa was to Angola just a few months ago, and a couple of weeks before he finished his term as president. And so we have Global Gateway, which is a new initiative to promote investment in Africa and other places in the world. So the competition is ongoing. We cannot forecast what is going to happen in the next years, but I think it's something that is we will keep seeing and observing and trying to find out what is going to happen. But raw materials are very important in Africa, and all these countries need to fix those raw materials, or at least prevent the rivals to have control over those raw materials. And as far as influence, competition for influence in Africa, I think for now it's okay.
Thank you very much. And maybe we will keep the order. The second question has to do with the eventual divisions in in the near future. Professor Carlos Gaspar, you want to?
It's a big issue. The breakup of China is a really big issue. It's the nightmare of the Chinese elites and has been. It's not an abstract issue in China. China was reunited only after 1949. Tibet was reconquered in 1951, 1952. And from the point of view of Beijing, Taiwan is still separated from China. So the issue of unity in China is a very present and issue for and it's part, of course, the Taiwan question is at the core of the national interest, precisely because the Chinese fear the breakup of China. The breakup of China for the Chinese elites is civil war. It's not going back to a division of the Chinese continent in multiple states. It's civil war, and it was civil war for most of the 20th century until 1949. Still, I'm not absolutely sure that there is any credible expectation outside of the Chinese elite that China is about to break up. The argument of the Chinese elites against democracy is precisely the risk of fragmentation of the Chinese continent. There was a democratic republican government in China in the early 20th century after the end of the Qing dynasty and with the new republic. And the republican democratic period was precisely a period of internal strife and civil war, both before and after the Second World War and during the Second World War. These are very important issues in China, but I don't think that any of the main actors in international relations is thinking about the United States, Russia, or India are really looking towards the breakup of China as a realistic scenario in their strategic calculation. But they may be wrong.
Thank you very much. We have another question about basically about the relations between Russia and China, and related also with artificial intelligence and other issues. I don't know who wants to answer this.
I try to answer the three questions, if I may.
Okay.
Yeah, just a brief thing.
Thank you. Fine.
On China's influence in China, in Africa, sorry. The first thing to say is that China is important for African countries for different reasons that African countries and Africa is important to China. To give you an idea what the 54 African countries represents to Chinese foreign trade is 4%. 3-4 times less than the EU or even the United States. What Africa as a whole continent, 54 countries represents in the Chinese foreign direct investment, it's 4%. So sometimes we have the wrong idea. Anyway, the interest of Africa to China is the same thing, the same kind of interest that we European or US or the Japanese or the South Koreans have in Africa. But still, China is a much better, comfortable partner for most African elites than Europeans. we need to keep in mind that the Club of Friends of China involves both democracies and autocracy, developed countries and developing countries. So for African elites, whether they are more or less democratic or autocratic, China is a very good alternative to the European Union and the United States, because we are used to have some eligible criteria to do business: rule of law, democracy, human rights, minority rights, and so on. Well, with the non-interference principle, China is having all the room to do business as usual, whatever happens in that country. But I think it's wrong always the narrative that Russia or China are trying to put us Europeans out of Africa. It is us, we Europeans, that sometimes, and Americans, that do not look properly to Africa. So if we pay more attention, show them that we are a better partner, maybe we could counter-influence China and, of course, Russia as well. On the question of China divided, well, if it is possible, everything it is possible. If the question is possible, the answer in international relations is always, it is possible. But it is probable, I don't think so. Historically, China has much more dynamics to be united than to fragmentation. Even in a lot of civil wars and lords of war, what they fight for is to see who of them is ruling the whole China, not to divide China. But the question, probably more important now, is not whether China is at risk of being fragmented. Is the Xi Jinping's dream of being part of the Chinese 500 years history, concluding the unity of China. That is a much bigger problem for us than the risk of fragmentation. But of course, if there is a fragmentation of a country with 1.5 billion people, can you imagine? Or an economic collapse of China? Can you imagine what happened with the mass Chinese migrants going on to other countries? That would be a nightmare for the global economy, stability of the whole countries. So I don't think in the future that will happen. But the question more worrying me is the attempt of Xi Jinping to conclude the unification of China. On Russia-China relations, I think Donald Trump will not succeed in dividing Russia and China. Of course, historically, China and Russia are rivals. Probably in the future, they will be rivals again. But for now, just look at the map. The strategic priority of Russia is European part. Ukraine next, Moldova, Baltic states, and so on. So Russia needs a very strong ally in their Asian back, China. The strategic priority of China is the China Seas and Taiwan. So also China needs a very strong ally in the Asian back. On the other hand, Russia is full of resources that China needs. And China is having technology and capital to invest in Russia. They both are against US hegemony, against Western values, against liberal order, and they don't want European or Western influence in the Asian between the two. So there are very strong reasons for Putin and Xi Jinping be close friends. They met 60 66 times. 66 times. Can you imagine this kind of relationship? Well, let's see how many times Donald Trump will meet Putin. They are close friends as well. So I don't think it is possible to divide right now. And if this is the main goal of this crazy US foreign policy under Trump 2, I don't think it will be succeeded. As we can see all the time, there is conversations between President Trump and President Putin. Putin talks also with Xi Jinping, including in conversation between US delegations and Russian delegations. There are conversations between the Chinese and Russian. In a very few weeks, there was another military exercise between China and Russia and Iran. Recently, the Chinese Foreign Affairs Minister was in Moscow again. Don't forget that for this kind of people, loyalty is one of the most important things. Do you remember which was the first foreign visit abroad that Xi Jinping made in March 2023 after being again Chinese president for the third time? Moscow, Russia. Immediately after Putin was targeted by the court with a mandate of war crimes. So I think put the whole things in this basket, divide, conquer, is not possible. It is the wrong approach, because at the same time, the US is putting aside traditional US allies, is promoting connection, relations, giving everything to Putin's Russia, and attacking European allies in particular. So that's why we need to think in another way, because Trump is forcing us to think in a different way. Of course, it's easier to say that probably this will be more or less the same, but the dream of Trump is a parenthesis, is the past. Maybe we could think that way in the first edition of Donald Trump, America First Policy. But now there is a chance that Biden is the parenthesis between Trump and Trumpians after. We'll see. But that's what I want to say for now.
Back to, yes, okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Well, please go ahead.
Okay. Coming back to the problem of influence, the competition for influence in Africa, I fully agree with Luis, as conditionality is, of course, something that makes for African countries much more comfortable to deal with China than with the West, of course. But I would like to come back to another issue that I forgot to mention, that is military bases. Probably in the future, we will see more military bases or military facilities for China in Africa. They already have one in Djibouti, and they are trying to find another one now in the Atlantic, in South Atlantic. And if they could find some military facilities in North Atlantic, they would come, of course, as well. And of course, some Portuguese-speaking countries may be on the list for China to go for those military facilities, which is something that affects us somehow, more or less directly. And the case I mentioned of Angola, the dispute for influence in Angola, the railway, I don't remember, the Lubito corridor, and it's something that is worth to be paying attention what happens in the future. Concerning the issue of unification, I would like to bring to this audience, because we are in Portugal, that one of the strategies that Chinese tried to put in place for reunification was the famous principle, one country, two systems, which is very much related to Macau and Hong Kong return to China. And well, at that times, 20 years ago, the Chinese thought that same principle could apply to Taiwan. It didn't happen. It's of course it didn't happen. I don't know. They probably we'll have to see what's going to happen. And the problem of unification and the fragmentation and unification, of course, there are many cycles in the long history of China, 3,000 or 4,000 years, China, periods of unification, and we know all those dynasties, Qing, Ming, Yuan, many others, and warring states as well, the civil war, as we had 2 times in the 20th centuries. And something that was very interesting to watch more than 20 years ago, in the 90s of the 20th century, when people still didn't know whether China would succeed in rising to being a great power and a superpower. There was a debate. Either we could see a coming collapse of China, coming collapse, or coming threat to the West. And those 2 ideas feed the debate as well between what would be the good strategy to address China, especially in the United States, between constructive engagement and containment. Well, by that time, containment was winning, but then came 9/11. The US has been distracted for 8 or 9 years or 10 years, which is perfectly understandable. And but that window of opportunity closed around 2010, 2012 with pivot to Asia, Obama's pivot to Asia, and then the other things. And so that's it. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you. Professor Carlos Gaspar wants to add something. Thank you.
It's still one country, 2 systems, the official formula in China's policy towards Taiwan, the reunification strategy. It was originally designed back in 1982 in relation to Taiwan, and it was only after that it was applied to Hong Kong and Macau. It succeeded in being, China succeeded in recovering Hong Kong and in the transfer of sovereignty in Macau. It did not succeed, of course, in the case of Taiwan, but it still sticks to the 1 country, 2 systems formula, which goes back to Deng Xiaoping. I was listening to Professor Luis Tomé, and how often President Xi and President Putin meet. And I was remembering a quote by John Kerry, the former US Secretary of State, who once asked his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, saying that they are constantly meeting, Xi and Putin are constantly, what do they talk about? And Lavrov answered, and according to Kerry, he said the main theme in their conversations is the end of the Soviet Union. So I imagine, I don't know if they still talk about the end of the, it's of course the problem of the breakup of China, in the sense that the end of the Soviet Union was the end of the Russian communist regime. And the nightmare of Xi Jinping is the end of the Chinese communist regime, which would lead to the breakup of China in his own view. He may be quite right. One last point. I do not have the same picture that Russian companies are investing in China. Chinese companies are investing in Russia. China became, after 2022, the main partner, or economic and trade partner of Russia. It replaced Germany as the main economic and trade partner. I do not have any information that the Russian artificial intelligence companies are competitive internationally. And I would like also to add that it is well known that President Putin does not own a cell phone, and that in his office you have typewriters instead of computers. So modernity and the digital revolution have yet to penetrate the inner circle of President Putin.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So the end of the Soviet Union is always there, and that's had many consequences. We still have one question in the audience and two. First,
Olá, my name is Katarina. So further down the line, if the US ceases to be a threat and Europe is weakened, don't you think that the internal and ideological differences between Russia and China will end up speaking louder? If so, how? Exactly what are the biggest differences that could cause friction, at least in the first phase, since we can't predict the future, but almost? Thank you.
Thank you. Please, microphone.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is José Elias Freitas. I wonder if it would not be realistic and fair intellectually to assume that China is winning on all cards, so to speak. Definitely irreversibly in a sense, from what you distinguished speakers have elaborated upon. It seems to me that China is winning by far the liberal order, and it sounds to me, as a citizen, that when we look at Ukraine, Russia, I can only think that China is, well, in a sense, is not pushing the trigger, but is like directing politically the war altogether. So it would not be sensible to decouple right away from China on the EU mindset and keep as long as possible the economic ties with US, because we are so much entangled, and decide that we need to decouple from China and and believe that the future chancellor is true to his words of making Europe independent. Would not that be more realistic? Thank you.
Thank you. Is anyone that wants to raise any question? Yes, there's someone. Yeah. Okay, there's a question here. I don't know if, yeah, it's a question. Is the Trump foreign policy a strong opportunity to China to reinforce its economic and potential relations with EU countries, occupying in that way the West's traditional presence in Europe? Is that a future risk for the European Union? It's the first question we have here. The second one is, in the speaker's view, does China have the capacity to turn into a global leader and live up to such a status, or is it likely to fall into the so-called Kindleberger trap? Alternatively, is it likely to turn into a responsible global stakeholder? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 questions, ideas, whatever. Who wants to begin the panel?
I must start addressing I think we can mix the questions or put them together.
Yes.
This idea of completely decoupling and create kind of modern spheres of influence, spheres of autonomy, autarkic worlds towards three different or completely disconnected worlds. I think it's extremely difficult. It's impossible. It's to come back to a world 5 centuries ago or 6 centuries ago or something like that. Yes, then we had Cold War and we had the capitalist world and the Western world and the communist world, and so the economies were kind of decoupled. It's true, but now supply chains are very much globalized. Of course, the regional patterns of coordination, economic coordination, are very important. Okay. But I think what the US and Europe are doing, the de-risking, despite with some differences between the European Union and the US, is trying to bring back to nearshoring to the supply chains. But complete decoupling, it's difficult because we would leave all the ground, so to say, to China to have this part of the world. I think it's extremely difficult. I don't see how Japanese and Koreans, even if they have talked after having been 5 years without talking, the 3 trade ministers met last week, Japan, South Korea, and China. But the very same day, those 3 trade ministers met after 5 years without talking to each other. The Secretary of Defense was received by the Japanese Prime Minister to tell him that the US-Japan alliance was ironclad, something that Europeans would like to have listened, but we haven't. So I think the full decoupling now it's difficult, but it's ongoing. Somehow it's ongoing, but I don't know what the outcome of all this is going to be, because the world is very much connected, and despite the idea of President Trump to conquer, to annex Greenland and Canada and to build kind of a utopian great island, a great North American fortress that can deal with climate change and all that, and they have the full resources and can be completely self-sufficient. And the US is very much, it's not completely self-sufficient, but it's very, they have many resources. They are independent in energy, now something that they were not 20 years ago. So despite all that, I think that the full decoupling and the 3 or 2 economic blocks without any kind of connection between them, it's difficult to happen, but we'll see. As Professor Wishtper said, future, if you ask me if something it's possible, everything it's possible, even the most utopian and dystopian futures that we cannot even imagine. One day they may be possible and probably very likely. Okay, thank you.
And don't forget the electric cars. Yeah. So, do you want to comment on other issues?
No, because we have to give time to others.
Please, Professor Gaspar. We have many other questions. Trump is really an opportunity to China.
Yes.
Yeah.
I took note. Yes, I want to go back to the first question about the ideological divisions between Russia and China. It's a point well taken. not everything is possible in the sense that we know that whatever the future of Russia's political system may be, it will not again be a communist regime. And yet its main ally, its main strategic ally is China, which is very much a communist regime and is stressing its nature as a communist regime in the last few years under Xi Jinping. In fact, we have a situation where, from an ideological point of view, the main trend in the present Republican administration is, in a sense, closer to the Russian political regime from the point of view of values shared by, I don't know, very sectarian and reactionary Catholic and evangelist trends in the Republican Party, and very reactionary trends in the Orthodox Church, which is an important pillar of the Russian political regime. So, in a sense, you can see political affinities between those two regimes. The ideologue of the Putin regime, Alexander Dugin, recognizes, perhaps is wrong, but he recognizes in the Trump election this convergence, this ideological convergence between Western and Russian Christian conservatives, and of course they could not be further apart from the communist regime in China. But we have many cases in the past where ideological opponents were allied. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were allied at the beginning of Second World War. And the United States and the Soviet Union were allied since 1941 until the end of the Second World War, and so on. And China, Communist China, and the United States were quasi-allies in the second part of. I will not go further. Well, so, but it's a point. It is an important point, and it's something that we do not discuss usually, but we should very much take into account. China is not winning across the board. It has problems like everyone else. It will have a tough time responding to the new situation, economic situation in relations with with the United States. Just to mention a point, it's obviously not commanding Russia in the war against Ukraine. It has been at times ambivalent in dealing with this Russian offensive against the Ukraine. Russia is very much a sovereign power, even when its dependencies grow, and they are growing, of course, vis-à-vis China. Prince Metternich had a famous quote about Russia, saying that Russia is never as strong as it says, and nor is it as weak as it seems. So we should look at Russia more soberly when we are evaluating this. China is not going to become, that's my last point, is not going to become a global power. China is a global superpower, perhaps not on a par with the United States, but close enough that we can look at international system and see that there are two superpowers competing with each other, and it's not going to change anytime soon. Of course, everything can happen, but probably it will not change anytime soon. But I don't think that China does have an alternative world order. Of course, the international legal order is not in a very good shape. Only the most optimists among us do think that it still exists, but that doesn't mean that China as an alternative. But I don't think that China as an alternative world order, and we may be moving towards a very Schmittian order of huge spaces competing with each other and aiming at autarcy, which is, I agree with you, a setback, a serious setback, but it could be the dominant trend. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, let just say a few words on ideological differences because, of course, they are totally different from ideological point of view, Russia and China, but they have something in common. They are both nationalists. Both regimes are very strong roots on nationalism, Russian nationalism and the Chinese nationalism. But they are not having this alliance in terms of ideological proximity. They are playing in terms of interests. Donald Trump is playing in terms of his vision of US interest. So ideological differences can be instrumentalized, but are not the main things that are promoting conflict or alliances. Now it's more probably than ever in the last century interests. And that is not a good thing because it depends of the view of interest from the ruler, whether it's a party or a group or a dictator. I think Russia will have a lot of problems in the succession of Vladimir Putin. Probably China will have less problems because there is the party. But so in the future, something bad could happen in the Putin's legacy if his succession is conflictful, not peaceful. China is winning this hyper-globalization, no doubt. And that means that maybe China is interested in keeping some of the rules and mechanisms that give China this kind of victory. But I think China has a view for a world order. Could be a kind of a old Confucianist system, tributarian system. We should remember that for more than 2,000 years, China was the central empire in East Asia. After 150 years, China is becoming again a superpower, but not only in Asia, in a globalized world. He's promoting not only the global community of shared future, is promoting the global commons on development, on security, on peace, but often has the opposite to criticize the US-led order, as the Chinese call it. But we don't know, and I don't think there is a proper idea, nor even in the Chinese leadership, what kind of world order they want. They want to be, of course, the hegemon. They are used to be the hegemon power, but the way to do it is not very clear till now. Strategically, China follows a grand strategy of real take part of all opportunities. In the Chinese mindset and strategies, they have two main concepts. One is the comprehensive national power, where China is comparing itself with other great powers. And the other one is the Xi, that we are used to translate to configuration of strategic power. But the real meaning is, in the Chinese mindset, in a period of opportunities, as they call the beginning of the 21st century, the better strategy is the one able to take part of all kind of opportunities. So if the strategy is able to take part of the opportunities in this context, it is a matter of time. It is growing step by step the comprehensive national power, and one day, could take some years or decades, China is at the top of the world power pyramid. The question is, Xi Jinping is much more confident on the Chinese strengths and more confident on the US vulnerabilities. So he's trying to accelerate the process to be the first during his time, China at the top during his lifetime, not only conquering maybe Taiwan and other territories, but surpass definitely the United States. My feeling is that with this policy, Trump administration is not stopping, is accelerating the US decline. And this is a wonderful opportunity to China. It will be probably a different hegemon than the US, of course, but according to all the variables in a world where everything is possible, the probability of China become the only superpower in the few decades from now is higher now than it was 6 months ago, in my view. And to answer the other question, I don't think it is possible or desirable for the European Union to decouple with China. Decoupling was never having consensus between European leaders. And now it's even worse. So because you need to have some kind of consensus, at least among the most important economies in Europe, to address such a thing. And as I said, I don't think it is desirable to decoupling from Russia, as you did it already on energy, deal with this kind of US administration. They are forcing us to do something, and at the same time, decouple from China. It is too much. If the European Union we succeeded in doing half of what he's saying, I would be very happy. If we, the European Union, will spend 400 billion euros and instead of 800 would be wonderful. But doing everything at the same time against all the other great powers, it is a little bit too much. Because at the same time, you want to keep addressing climate change, social security, unemployment, supporting farmers in France, and so it is many things to do at the same time. Right now, maybe is not dreaming to be the first one and fighting in all directions. At the same time, I would suggest that we now finally must understand that we should not put all eggs in the same basket. Usually, for decades, we put all our security and defense on the same hands, on the same basket. That is not possible anymore. If we want to be a little bit more safe and put Russian and US and also Chinese a little bit more away and keep our interests in our hands, we should do something on this regard, but not fighting against all the others at the same time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, we are approaching the end of our session today. I would try to sum up what we have exchanged here very quickly, saying that yes, China is in a certain way filling some empty spaces in Africa. Trump will not divide this China-Russia agreement. or relationship or friendship is difficult or impossible to decouple from China. And yes, Trump, in a certain way, should be an opportunity to China, and China, for sure, in the future will perform as a global player. I don't know if I forgot anything else, but this is the kind of conclusion I would to say. Is it okay? Any additional comments from the panel? No? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much to be with us today. We will meet here in the same place by the beginning of June, June the 2nd. But of course, in the meantime, we will circulate the announcement of that other meeting with another very interesting topic, which is EU-Russia relationship. And as we still have 1 month and something ahead of us, many things will for sure happen in this world. So we will meet with very interesting additional ideas. Thank you very much, and see you in June.